In 2019, a team of researchers flying over the Louisiana bayous turned on a laser scanner and aimed it straight down at the ground. What they pulled back out of that data, underneath the cypress trees, underneath the swamp water, underneath thousands of years of silt, was not supposed to exist. A grid, perfectly straight lines, right angles, geometric shapes repeating across hundreds of square miles of southern Louisiana. And here is the part that breaks the entire accepted timeline. The grid sits underneath river sediment that the Mississippi laid down before it carved out its current path, which means somebody built this thing with engineered precision before the river ran the way it does today. That is not a small discrepancy. That is 1,000 years of missing history, minimum. Some researchers are saying it could be 3,000, and nobody wants to talk about who built it. If you find buried civilizations and erased history interesting, hit subscribe right now. We dig into the stuff the textbooks refuse to print every single week. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Lidar actually does. Lidar stands for light detection and ranging. The way it works is a plane flies over an area and fires millions of laser pulses at the ground every second. Most of those pulses bounce off the tops of trees and bushes and whatever else is in the way, but some of them sneak through the gaps in the canopy and hit the actual ground. The computer takes those ground-hit pulses, throws away everything else, and builds a three-dimensional map of the bare earth, as if every tree, every shrub, every house, every road had been wiped clean off the surface. This is the technology that found the lost Mayan cities in Guatemala. This is what revealed the buried streets of Angkor in Cambodia. And in 2019, it was pointed at Louisiana. What it found there has been quietly making the rounds in academic circles, but you will not see it on the evening news. The scans show a network of berms, canals, mounds, and what look like raised roadways arranged in a pattern that has no business being there. The lines run north to south and east to west with the kind of precision you only get from people who understand surveying. The shapes repeat. Squares within squares, concentric rings, long parallel ridges that cross other long parallel ridges at exact 90-degree angles. This is not a natural formation. Nature does not do right angles at scale. Nature does not do repeating geometry across hundreds of square miles. Something built this. And that is where the dating problem comes in. The Mississippi River is one of the most studied rivers on the planet. Geologists have mapped in detail every channel it has ever flowed through going back about 10,000 years. They call these old channels meander scars, and you can see them from space like ghost rivers running across the delta. The current path of the Mississippi is geologically young. It only settled into its present course around 500 years ago, give or take. Before that, the river was farther west. Before that, even farther west. The river has been swinging back and forth across southern Louisiana for millennia, depositing sediment everywhere it went. The buried grid is underneath at least two of those older sediment layers. That is the part the geologists cannot explain. If the grid was built by a Native American civilization in the last few thousand years, it should sit on top of those layers, not underneath them. It should be the most recent thing in the soil column, not the oldest. But the Lidar returns show the structure sitting below sediment that was deposited when the Mississippi was running through a channel that nobody alive has ever seen. Some of those channels have not existed for somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 years. Mainstream archaeology has a problem with this. The official story of pre-Columbian Louisiana goes something like this. There were the Mississippian peoples, the mound builders, the Caddoans, the Tunica, the Natchez. They built earthworks, sure, including some genuinely impressive ones. Poverty Point in northeast Louisiana is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is older than the pyramids at Giza. But Poverty Point is a single complex, not a grid spanning hundreds of square miles. And even Poverty Point, with all its sophistication, is only about 3,500 years old. The buried grid, if the geological dating holds up, is older than that, possibly much older. And it is not one site, it is a continent-scale infrastructure project. This is the kind of finding that brings up a word a lot of independent researchers have been whispering about for years: Tartaria. The name comes from old European maps. Right up until the 1700s, cartographers labelled enormous chunks of the planet as Tartaria or Grand Tartary. The map showed it as a sprawling empire that covered most of Eurasia, parts of North America, and significant chunks of what we now call the Americas. And then, sometime in the 18th and 19th centuries, the word disappeared from the maps. The empire vanished from the textbooks. The cities were renamed, the borders were redrawn, and we were told that Tartaria was just a vague European term for a region nobody really understood. That is the official line. But the deeper you dig into the historical record, the stranger the picture gets. Architectural styles that look identical across continents, star forts on every populated landmass, cathedrals standing in cities that supposedly had no population to build them, census records that show massive die-offs in places where no plague is documented, photographs from the 1800s showing empty streets in cities that supposedly had hundreds of thousands of residents. The story does not add up, and the Louisiana grid sitting underneath river sediment, older than anything in the official timeline, might be one more piece of evidence that something very large was here before us, something organized, something that knew how to engineer at continental scale, and something that got erased. Here is what makes the Louisiana scans particularly hard to dismiss. The geometry matches. If you take the layout of the buried grid and overlay it on documented Tartaria era sites in other parts of the world, the proportions repeat. The same ratios, the same spacing, the same orientation to true north. Researchers who have spent years cataloguing these patterns will tell you that there is a signature, a kind of engineering fingerprint that shows up over and over again across continents that supposedly never communicated with each other. The Louisiana grid carries that fingerprint, and it is buried under enough sediment to push it firmly outside the timeline that academic history allows. There is another detail that researchers keep coming back to. The grid is not just earthworks. The Lidar returns are showing what look like the foundations of structures. Rectangular outlines, circular outlines, foundations that suggest buildings, not just mounds. And the spacing between those foundations is consistent. The same setback from the road, the same orientation, the same proportions. If you were planning a city today with modern surveying equipment and a centralized building code, you would end up with something that looks a lot like what is sitting under that swamp. That is what is making people uncomfortable. Because nobody in the academic timeline of North America was supposed to be building cities like that. Not in that location, not at that scale, and definitely not before the Mississippi was running through its current channel. So what do we know about who built it? Honestly, almost nothing. The names are gone, the languages are gone. The records, if there were records, were either destroyed or are sitting in archives nobody has access to. What we have is the ground itself, the earthworks, the geometry, the infrastructure pattern. And what that infrastructure tells us is that whoever was here knew how to survey land, how to move massive amounts of dirt, how to engineer water flow, and how to coordinate construction across an area larger than several modern countries. That is not a hunter-gatherer society. That is not a chiefdom. That is a civilization. The Native American tribes who were living in Louisiana when Europeans arrived have their own oral histories about this. The Choctaw, the Houma, the Atacapa, all have stories about an older people who were there before. People who built the mounds, dug the channels, raised the roads. Stories about a cataclysm, a great flood, a time when the rivers ran differently and the land was reshaped. These stories were dismissed for centuries as mythology. But mythology has a way of preserving real events in coded language. And the geology is now starting to suggest that the cataclysm part might not have been imaginary. And it is not just the Louisiana tribes. Move west into Texas and the Karankawa told the same story. Move east into Mississippi and Alabama and the Creek and the Chickasaw told the same story. Move north into the Ohio Valley and the Shawnee told the same story. An older people, a different people, a people who came before, who built in stone and earth, who knew the stars and who were wiped out. The stories cross tribal lines, cross language families, cross thousands of miles. When that many separate cultures preserve the same memory, you are not looking at folklore anymore. You are looking at history that survived in the only format available to people who lost their writing. There is evidence across the Gulf Coast of a massive rapid flood event somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 years ago. The mainstream theory blames it on the melting of the North American ice sheets at the end of the last ice age. Glacial Lake Agassiz drained catastrophically. Sea levels jumped, coastlines moved inland by miles in a matter of weeks. Whole landscapes were redrawn. If a civilization was living on the Gulf Coast at that time, it would have been wiped out almost overnight. The buildings would have been buried under sediment. The roads would have been submerged. The geometry would have been hidden under a new river system carving a new path. And 10,000 years later, a laser scanner from an airplane would be the only way to see what was underneath. That timeline lines up. It lines up uncomfortably well. And it raises a question that mainstream archaeology has been allergic to for over a century. What if civilization is older than we have been told? What if the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution, the engineering revolution did not start in Mesopotamia around 5000 BC? What if they started somewhere else much earlier and got erased by something nobody saw coming? The Louisiana grid is not proof of that on its own, but it is one more data point, and the data points are starting to pile up. There is one more thing about these scans that has not been widely reported, and it is the part that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The grid is not just buried, it is aligned, and the alignment is precise enough that you cannot wave it off as coincidence. The major axes of the structure point directly to other known ancient sites. Lines drawn from the Louisiana complex to specific points in Central America, to specific points in the Ohio Valley Mound Builder complex, to specific points along the Atlantic coast, all hit the targets within a fraction of a degree. That kind of alignment does not happen by accident. That is somebody putting a marker down and knowing exactly where the other markers are, which means whoever built the Louisiana grid was part of a larger network. They knew where the other sites were. They could measure distance and direction across thousands of miles of unmapped wilderness, and they coordinated. The implications are enormous. If even half of what the Lidar scans are showing turns out to be real, we are looking at a civilization that predated everything in the textbook, a civilization with continental reach, a civilization that vanished, and a civilization that left enough physical evidence in the ground that all you need to find it is a plane, a laser, and a willingness to look. The plane and the laser part is already done. The question now is whether anyone is going to be willing to look at what the data is showing without flinching. There are independent teams working on follow-up scans right now. Some of them are quietly funded. Some of them have been blocked from publishing their results. Some of them have had their permits to fly over certain areas pulled at the last minute. That is not nothing. That is the behavior of an academic establishment that is afraid of what is going to come up next. Because once the Louisiana grid gets confirmed in the peer-reviewed literature, the next question is, what else is buried? Underneath the Amazon, underneath the Sahara, underneath the Russian steppe, the same scanning technology can be turned on any of those places. And if Louisiana is what it looks like, those scans are going to find more. For now, the grid sits there, underneath the swamps, underneath the silt, underneath thousands of years of a river that did not exist when the grid was built, waiting for somebody to take it seriously. The textbooks have not caught up yet. The history books have not caught up yet, but the laser does not lie. The geometry is in the ground. And eventually, somebody is going to have to explain how it got there. If this story has you wondering what else is buried, what else has been quietly scanned and quietly shelved, the video on screen right now goes deeper into the global pattern. The forts, the cathedrals, the empty cities, the disappearing empire. Watch it next and decide for yourself how much of what we have been taught is actually true.